Let us begin. Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, allow yourself to drift gently into the pages of ancient history. We are about to follow the footsteps of a man whose ambition reshaped the world, Alexander the Great. As you relax and close your eyes, imagine the vast landscapes of Persia, Egypt, and India. Picture a time long past where empires rose and fell on the shoulders of kings and visionaries. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Legend. In the warm, sun-drenched summer of 356 BCE, in the ancient Macedonian capital of Pella, a child was born beneath an air heavy with omens. The night sky shimmered with stars, and a great fire blazed across the heavens, a comet, perhaps, or a portent sent by the gods. It was said that the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground that same night, as if to mark the coming of one whose destiny would shape the world. The child's name was Alexander. His mother, Olympias, was of Epirote royal blood, a woman of intense spirituality and unshakable will. She was said to have snakes in her chambers, sacred serpents that symbolized the gods she so deeply revered. His father was King Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant military strategist and ambitious monarch who had transformed Macedon from a fractured hill kingdom into the most powerful force in the Greek world. From the beginning, Alexander was told he was different, special, destined. Olympias whispered ancient myths into his ear as he slept, tales of Achilles, son of the sea nymph Thetis, whose wrath nearly brought ruin upon the Achaeans at Troy. She insisted that Alexander's bloodline could be traced to the hero himself, and even further, to Heracles, son of Zeus. Some believed that Olympias encouraged the idea that Alexander was not Philip's child at all, but born of Zeus himself, descended from the divine. These were not merely maternal fantasies. They would become the foundation of Alexander's identity. Philip, ever the pragmatist, had different concerns. He saw in his son a future leader and wanted him prepared not for myth, but for rule. He brought in the finest minds of the age to shape Alexander's mind. Among them was Aristotle, the great philosopher, a student of Plato and the tutor who would shape the prince's worldview more than any other. Under Aristotle, Alexander was not merely taught logic and rhetoric, but astronomy, biology, ethics, poetry, politics, and the pursuit of knowledge itself. The philosopher introduced him to the Iliad, which Alexander treasured deeply. He would later sleep with a copy under his pillow, annotated in his own hand. Achilles, the hero of that epic, became a figure of obsession, not just a model, but a standard to surpass. As a child, Alexander displayed traits that startled those around him: unshakable confidence, a sharp and probing mind, and an intense emotional nature. He rarely backed down from an argument and often demanded to know why things were the way they were. One story tells of a group of Persian ambassadors who came to Philip's court. While other boys played, Alexander interrogated the men about the roads of Persia, the strength of their armies, and the nature of their king. Even then, his gaze was set far beyond Macedon. When Alexander was only 12, a moment occurred that would be told and retold for generations. A great, wild horse was brought before the court, a massive black stallion named Bucephalus. No one could tame the beast. It reared and thrashed, resisting even the most experienced handlers. The courtiers laughed when Alexander stepped forward, but the boy noticed something others hadn't. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Turning Bucephalus toward the sun so the shadows fell behind him, Alexander mounted the stallion and rode it with ease. The court was stunned. Philip, watching proudly, is said to have wept, embracing his son and declaring, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." And perhaps it was, but greatness would not come easily. Alexander's family was powerful, but also unstable. The royal court of Macedon was rife with intrigue. Olympias and Philip quarreled often. Philip had other wives, other children, and dreams of expanding his legacy. He would eventually marry a younger woman, Cleopatra Eurydice, and tensions flared. Some say Alexander stormed out of a banquet in a rage when his legitimacy was insulted. He and his mother left court. A bitter rift had formed. Still, Philip never stopped investing in Alexander's education in both war and statesmanship. As a teenager, Alexander was given command of troops and proved himself on the battlefield. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, just 18 years old, Alexander led a decisive cavalry charge that shattered the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit feared across Greece. It was a coming-of-age moment, a young lion proving himself in blood and strategy. And then the world changed. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated during a wedding celebration. The circumstances were murky and rumors swirled of betrayal, jealousy, and plots. Some whispered that Olympias had a hand in it, others blamed foreign enemies. But one fact was clear: Alexander, only 20 years old, now stood at the edge of a throne forged in fire. Despite his youth, he acted swiftly. Rivals and dissenters were eliminated. The nobility bent the knee. Even the powerful Greek city-states, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, reluctantly accepted the authority of this young king. The League of Corinth reaffirmed Macedonian leadership, and Alexander was named strategos autokrator, supreme commander, for the campaign long dreamed of by his father, the invasion of Persia. From the burning skies of Pella to the blood-soaked plains of Chaeronea, the legend was taking shape. But the story, the true story, was only just beginning. Chapter 2: The Rise to Power. When a king dies, especially one as formidable as Philip of Macedon, the world does not pause in mourning. It holds its breath. The question is not simply who will wear the crown, but whether the crown itself will survive the chaos. It was 336 BCE, and the great halls of Macedon were darkened not only by grief, but by danger. King Philip had been assassinated at a wedding feast, stabbed to death by one of his bodyguards, a man named Pausanias. What motivated the assassin remains a mystery lost to history: revenge, jealousy, conspiracy, perhaps even Olympias herself. Whispers of her involvement would linger for centuries. But in that moment, all eyes turned to Alexander, a 20-year-old prince now thrust into power at the head of a dangerous and fractious kingdom. He had no guarantee of loyalty, no certainty of succession. Macedonian nobles were proud and ruthless. Many of them had their own claims to the throne. Some believed the young prince would falter, that he would be a boy trying to wear a man's armor. They were wrong. Alexander acted with stunning speed and decisiveness. He secured his claim with calculated force. Those who challenged his authority were eliminated. His rivals, even members of his own extended family, were swiftly executed or exiled. In a chilling but effective consolidation of power, he had his cousin Amyntas put to death, and Olympias saw to it that Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's latest wife, and her infant daughter were removed permanently. It was brutal, but it was necessary. The throne of Macedon did not allow for mercy. By the year's end, Alexander stood alone, his rule uncontested. But ruling Macedon was only the beginning. The true test would be to command Greece, a region of city-states that had long resisted unity, brimming with rivalries and old hatreds. Philip had subdued them through war and diplomacy. Now they wondered, would the son match the father? Alexander moved swiftly to answer. He rode south with a small force, not to conquer, but to command. In Thessaly, opposition crumbled as he approached. In Thebes and Athens, the mood was tense but uncertain. Many feared a return to war, but Alexander chose careful diplomacy. He met with leaders, reaffirmed treaties, and reminded them that he had been chosen by the League of Corinth, the same coalition Philip had forged to lead the Greeks in a war of vengeance against Persia. Surprisingly, most city-states accepted him. Perhaps they remembered his role at Chaeronea. Perhaps they were impressed by his calm authority. Or perhaps they were merely waiting, watching to see if this young man would last. But there were always outliers. In the north, the Thracian tribes, fierce warriors beyond the Greek world, saw Philip's death as an opportunity. They rose in rebellion, as did the Illyrians and other tribes near the Danube. Alexander responded without hesitation. In the spring of 335 BCE, he marched north with his army through the harsh terrain of the Balkans, battling in mountainous passes and against determined enemies. His campaign was relentless. He crossed the Haemus Mountains, defeated the Triballi, and reached the Danube River, a feat few Greek armies had achieved. At one point, he constructed makeshift rafts and crossed the great river under cover of darkness to surprise the enemy on the far shore. It wasn't just victory, it was a message. There is no place I will not go, no enemy I will not face. As he returned south, triumphant, news reached him. Thebes had revolted. The city of Thebes, proud and defiant, had declared Macedonian rule over. Rumors had spread that Alexander had died in the north, and the city believed it had a chance to break free. Encouraged by Athenian sympathizers and old hatreds, Thebes armed itself. Alexander's response was swift and unforgettable. He marched his army nearly 300 miles in just under 2 weeks. When Thebes saw him outside their walls, many could hardly believe it. The boy king was not dead. He was very much alive and furious. He offered mercy at first. He gave the Thebans a chance to surrender, to spare their city. They refused. What followed was destruction. The Macedonian army stormed the walls, breached the defenses, and crushed the rebellion. Thebes was razed to the ground. Over 6,000 were killed, and more than 30,000 were enslaved. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message to the rest of Greece was deafening in its silence. Rebellion would not be tolerated. Athens, watching carefully, chose not to intervene. With Greece now firmly under control, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. His father's dream, the great campaign against the Persian Empire, was now his to command. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander prepared to cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. It was a symbolic passage. Once he stepped foot in Asia Minor, he would no longer be just a king of Macedon. He would become something greater, a conqueror, an avenger, perhaps even a god in the making. Before he crossed, he visited the legendary site of Troy. There, he paid homage to his hero, Achilles. Some say he ran naked to the tomb of the warrior, an ancient rite of respect. Others claim he left offerings, or that he whispered to the winds, seeking guidance from the past. Whatever he did, one thing is certain. In Alexander's mind, the journey ahead was more than military, it was mythic. He was not simply marching to war, he was retracing the path of heroes. And so, with his army of 40,000, a mix of hardened Macedonian phalangites, Greek allies and mercenaries, he stepped onto the shores of Asia. The world would never be the same again. Chapter 3. Into Asia. The morning sun rose slowly over the waters of the Hellespont, painting the waves in soft gold as Alexander's ship slipped quietly toward the Asian shore. The sea was calm, almost reverent, as if it too sensed the weight of the moment. Here was a young king, just 22 years old, stepping into the land of legends, bound for the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known. As he disembarked on the western coast of Asia Minor, Alexander did something deeply symbolic. He took up a spear and thrust it into the earth. It was not just a gesture of possession, it was a declaration. He claimed Asia not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a rightful heir, come to avenge the centuries-old Persian invasion of Greece. The campaign began in earnest almost immediately. The first challenge came near the banks of the Granicus River, where the Persian satraps, local governors loyal to King Darius III, had assembled a force to stop him. The battle was fierce. The Persian cavalry lined the far bank, their numbers strong and their position advantageous. Crossing a river under fire was always risky, but Alexander was never one to hesitate. He led the charge himself, riding alongside his companions, the elite cavalry that served as both bodyguards and brothers in arms. In the chaos of the clash, Alexander was nearly killed, his helmet shattered, his armor bloodied. But he survived, and his army broke through. The Persian force collapsed. Victory at the Granicus sent shockwaves through the region. City after city along the Aegean coast opened their gates to him: Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus. In some places, Alexander removed tyrants and installed democratic governments, presenting himself as a liberator from Persian rule. In others, he offered religious dedications and preserved temples, respecting the local gods. It was a policy of both steel and silk. Conquest, yes, but also careful diplomacy. As he moved deeper into Asia Minor, he encountered not just resistance, but terrain that tested his army. Mountain passes, arid stretches, fortified towns all posed challenges. Yet Alexander pressed on. His energy was relentless. He led by example, sharing hardships with his men, marching beside them, enduring the same hunger, thirst, and sleepless nights. His charisma forged loyalty stronger than any oath. Then came Gordium. In the ancient city, he encountered a legendary artifact, the Gordian knot, a massive knot of rope tied to an ancient chariot said to have been placed there by King Gordius centuries earlier. The prophecy claimed that whoever could untie it would become the ruler of Asia. Alexander examined it briefly. Some say he tried to unravel it, pulling at the strands with delicate care. Others say he studied it only for a moment, then drew his sword and sliced through it with a single stroke. "It does not matter how the knot is undone," he is said to have remarked. The symbolism was unmistakable. Alexander was not here to solve problems slowly. He was here to cut through them. But Persia had not yet fully awakened. Far to the east, Darius III, King of Kings, learned of the young Macedonians' victories. At first, he underestimated him. Alexander was just a boy, a distant threat, an annoyance in the empire's far west. But as city after city fell and the western provinces shifted allegiance, it became clear that this was no ordinary warlord. Darius began to gather his forces, a massive army drawn from the vast reaches of his empire, from Egypt to Bactria, from the Persian heartland to the mountains of Armenia. He would face Alexander himself, and soon. In the meantime, Alexander moved along the southern coast of Asia Minor, capturing the port cities and cutting off the Persian fleet from resupply. He fought battles in Cilicia, conquered mountainous fortresses, and took control of key naval bases without ever needing a strong fleet of his own. It was a masterstroke, defeating the Persian navy by land. As the year turned to 333 BCE, Alexander fell ill. Exhaustion, fever, perhaps infection. It nearly claimed him. His men were terrified. Without him, the campaign would surely collapse, but he recovered, slowly at first, then with renewed vigor. His survival only added to the growing myth that surrounded him. Then, in a narrow pass near the town of Issus, the armies met. Alexander, with perhaps 40,000 men, faced a Persian force more than twice that size. Darius himself commanded the army, seated in a golden chariot at the center of an ocean of infantry and cavalry. Persian banners fluttered in the wind. Their numbers were overwhelming, but numbers were not everything. Alexander studied the terrain. The battlefield was hemmed in by mountains and sea, narrow, tight, ideal for neutralizing the enemy's advantage in size. He placed his troops with surgical precision, anchoring his flanks and positioning his phalanx, the spear-wielding core of his army, to hold firm. Then he led the charge. Riding on the right with his companion cavalry, Alexander cut through the enemy line with terrifying speed. The Persians fought valiantly, but they were uncoordinated. When Alexander aimed his strike toward Darius's chariot, the Persian king fled. Panic spread through the ranks. The battle turned into a rout. Tens of thousands died or were captured. Among the captives were Darius's wife, mother, and daughters, taken not as slaves, but treated with great respect. Alexander ensured their comfort and dignity. His behavior was not just noble, it was political. He wanted the Persian people to see him not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a rightful king. The Battle of Issus was not just a victory, it was a thunderclap, a sign to the world that the Macedonian king was no longer a threat on the edge of empire, but a force at its heart. And he was far from finished. Chapter 4: Siege and Splendor, Tyre and Egypt. The path of conquest is rarely straight. After Issus, Alexander could have pushed east, deeper into the Persian heartland, but he did not. Instead, he turned south toward the rich and rebellious lands along the eastern Mediterranean. He understood something crucial. To defeat Persia, he would need more than victories on land. He would need control of the sea, and to control the sea, he needed to take Tyre. The island city of Tyre stood a short distance from the coast, surrounded by massive walls that rose high above the crashing surf. It was ancient, proud, and virtually impregnable. The Tyrians, descendants of the Phoenicians, were master sailors. They believed they could outlast any siege. At first, Alexander tried diplomacy. He asked to enter the city to sacrifice to the god Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, Alexander's mythical ancestor. But the Tyrians refused. They would not admit a foreign king, no matter how glorious. So Alexander laid siege. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of engineering in ancient warfare. Since Tyre sat offshore, Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway, a massive land bridge built from stones, timber, and debris, stretching from the mainland to the city's walls. Day by day, his men toiled, pushing forward under constant harassment from Tyrian ships and archers. The Tyrians responded with fire and fury. They sent ships filled with flaming pitch to destroy the causeway. They launched surprise attacks, but Alexander adapted. He brought in siege towers, catapults, and finally, ships of his own, provided by his newly allied Phoenician ports to the north. The siege lasted 7 grueling months. And then the walls were breached. Macedonian forces poured into the city from the sea and from the battered causeway. What followed was brutal. Tyre was burned, thousands were slaughtered, and over 30,000 citizens were sold into slavery. It was a message, not just to Persia, but to any who would defy the king. Yet, even here, in destruction, Alexander sought legacy. He offered sacrifices to Melkart in the temple he had once been denied. He had won, and he claimed the city not only by force, but by faith. From Tyre, Alexander moved further south. He encountered little resistance. The cities of Palestine and Phoenicia opened their gates. Gaza, however, resisted and paid dearly. The city fell after a hard siege and its defenders were executed. Again, the lesson was clear: resistance would bring ruin. But then the war paused, not in defeat, but in wonder, as Alexander reached Egypt. Egypt, ancient and proud, had long been under Persian control. But the Egyptians never loved their foreign rulers. When Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, he was not seen as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian satrap fled before him. The people welcomed Alexander with celebration. The priests of the temples offered him divine honors. In the sacred city of Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, a living god, the son of Amun. To the Greeks, this was extraordinary. To the Egyptians, it was destiny. And Alexander accepted it. He visited the great temples. He respected local customs. He offered sacrifices to the Egyptian gods. And then he did something entirely his own. He founded a new city. On the Mediterranean coast, where the Nile meets the sea, he ordered the construction of Alexandria, a city that would bear his name. It was to be a beacon of Greek culture, a gateway between East and West, a center of trade and knowledge. Though Alexander would never see its full glory, Alexandria would become one of the most important cities in history, home to the legendary library, the towering lighthouse, and generations of philosophers, scientists, and poets. But the greatest moment in Egypt was still to come. In the heart of the desert, far to the west, lay the oracle of Siwa, a temple of the god Amun, nestled in an oasis beyond the reach of most travelers. Few Greeks had ever made the journey. The way was treacherous, hot winds, shifting sands, and deadly silence. But Alexander was not deterred. He crossed the desert with a small escort, enduring blistering heat and near death from thirst. Legend says that serpents guided him. Others say that rain fell where it never had before. Whether myth or miracle, he reached the temple. There, in the cool, dark inner sanctum, the priests of Amun received him. What passed between them is unknown. They may have spoken in riddles, in ritual language. But when Alexander emerged, something had changed. He had asked the oracle a question. Some say whether he was truly the son of Zeus Ammon. The answer, whispered through time, was yes. From that moment on, Alexander no longer claimed merely to descend from heroes. He embraced the idea that he was, in some divine way, chosen, favored, perhaps even immortal. He had conquered Egypt without a battle. He had stood in the temples of gods. He had been crowned a pharaoh. Now he turned east once more to finish what he had begun. The great King Darius awaited him in the heart of Persia, and the stage was set for their final confrontation. Chapter 5. Gaugamela, the fall of an empire. The Persian Empire, once the master of half the known world, now trembled before a single man. Alexander's march across Asia had shattered satrapies, humbled cities, and shaken thrones. And yet, the heart of Persia still beat. Darius III, the great king, had survived the rout at Issus, and now gathered the full might of his empire for a final stand. The place was Gaugamela, a plain near the Tigris River, open, flat, and expansive, ideal for Persian cavalry and war chariots. Darius had chosen it deliberately, confident this battlefield would allow his overwhelming numbers to swallow the smaller Macedonian force. He brought everything. Accounts speak of over 200,000 soldiers, infantry from Babylon, cavalry from Bactria, archers from Susa, Indian war elephants, and the terrifying scythed chariots that could mow down ranks like wheat. Darius had even ordered the land cleared and leveled to make it perfect for maneuvering. Alexander, by contrast, arrived with an army of perhaps 40,000 foot soldiers and 7,000 cavalry. Tired, lean, but disciplined and fiercely loyal. He made camp near the battlefield, and then, in an extraordinary show of composure, he waited. He wanted his men rested. He studied the terrain. He even held a war council, listening to his generals. Some advised a night attack to catch the Persians off guard, but Alexander refused. "I do not steal my victories," he reportedly said. "Let Darius see that I defeat him in the light of day." And so as dawn broke on October 1st, 331 BCE, the two greatest armies on earth faced each other under a pale morning sun. Alexander's strategy was genius in motion. He placed his phalanx, the bristling wall of sarissas, each pike over 15 feet long, at the center. On the right flank, he commanded his elite companion cavalry. On the left, the veteran general Parmenion held firm with Thessalian horsemen and light infantry. The Persians surged forward, trying to encircle the Macedonian army. Scythed chariots raced across the field, blades spinning, but Alexander had prepared. His men opened lanes, letting the chariots pass harmlessly, then cut them down from behind. The phalanx held. Then came the pivotal moment. Alexander saw an opening. He shifted his cavalry diagonally, a sudden, angular maneuver that exposed his flank but drew the Persian forces outward. Darius, believing he had Alexander vulnerable, committed troops to the trap. And that's when Alexander struck. With lightning speed, he led his cavalry in a direct charge toward the center, straight for Darius. Macedonian spears crashed against Persian shields. The royal chariot shuddered, panic spread. Darius once again turned and fled, his second flight before Alexander. The Persian army, seeing their king retreat, collapsed into chaos. On the left flank, Parmenion struggled. He had been nearly overwhelmed, but Alexander, victorious in the center, wheeled back to reinforce him. The Persians, caught between an unbreakable phalanx and cavalry from both flanks, were annihilated. Tens of thousands died. The battlefield was soaked in blood and broken armor. Gaugamela was not just a victory, it was the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius fled east, deeper into his own lands. He had lost his capital, his treasury, and now his claim to power. Alexander was no longer a rival, he was the master of Asia. The road to Babylon lay open. When Alexander entered the legendary city, it did not resist. Its priests, nobles, and citizens welcomed him. Gold poured into his hands. The great temples were preserved. He honored the gods of the land as he had in Egypt. Once more, he played not the destroyer, but the rightful heir. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, where the treasure of the Persian Empire was stored, over 50,000 talents of gold and silver, an amount so vast it staggered even Alexander's most seasoned officers. He did not hoard it. He paid his men, rewarded his allies, and ensured that his conquest was seen not only as a triumph, but as prosperity. Then he turned to Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, the city of kings. Here Alexander hesitated. He had conquered the empire. Darius was defeated. But some part of him wanted closure, revenge perhaps for the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier. The memory of Athens burned by Xerxes still lingered. He entered the city and at first showed respect. But in a moment of drunken revelry, perhaps urged on by companions, perhaps by his own rising myth, Alexander ordered the burning of the great palace of Xerxes. The flames rose high into the night, devouring marble, wood, and gold. Some later claimed he regretted it, that he watched the fire with silent remorse, that he had burned not a king's house, but his own inheritance. But the message was clear. The empire that had once scorched Greece had now been reduced to ash by a son of Hellas. With the fire of Persepolis still glowing behind him, Alexander resumed his march. Darius, once the king of kings, now wandered as a fugitive, betrayed by his own satraps, hunted by his former commanders. Alexander would not rest until he found him. Chapter 6, Pursuit and Betrayal, the Death of Darius. The Persian Empire had fallen, but the great king still lived. To Alexander, this was unacceptable. His conquest would remain incomplete so long as Darius drew breath. It was not merely a matter of politics or military pride. It had become something deeper. Perhaps he needed closure. Perhaps he believed only Darius's capture would grant him the divine legitimacy he now felt entitled to. And so the hunt began. Darius had fled eastward after Gaugamela, deeper into the vastness of his own empire. With him went a few loyal commanders, a dwindling guard, and what remained of his dignity. He hoped to gather support in the eastern provinces, in Bactria and Sogdiana, lands on the fringe of Persian control. He still believed that with time he might raise another army and turn the tide. But time was no longer his ally. Alexander pursued relentlessly. He moved quickly, his forces carving through mountains and deserts, his scouts sweeping the land ahead like birds of prey. He did not pause to consolidate power. He knew that if Darius escaped too far east, rebellion might stir in his wake. As the chase continued, the true decay of Persian unity revealed itself. Among those closest to Darius was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Intelligent, ambitious, and increasingly disillusioned with his king, Bessus had his own designs. He watched as Darius's influence dwindled. He listened as soldiers questioned their purpose, and in time he began plotting treason. Bessus believed that the empire could still be saved, but only under his rule. If he could remove Darius and present himself as the new great king, he might unite the eastern provinces, rally the satraps, and mount a resistance against Alexander. So in the shadowed hills of Hyrcania, Bessus made his move. He arrested Darius, binding his former sovereign in chains. The king of kings, once the ruler of millions, was now a prisoner of his own governors. Bessus declared himself Artaxerxes V, claiming the mantle of Persia and abandoning the wounded legacy of his predecessor. Alexander, learning of the betrayal, was furious. To him, Darius was not only an enemy, he was a royal opponent, a legitimate rival. He had fought him honorably. To capture Darius alive would have meant a symbolic unification of East and West. But now that opportunity was slipping away. He drove his men harder, refusing to rest. Days turned into weeks. Through deserts and across rivers, the Macedonians chased the fleeing traitors. And then one day, they found them. According to ancient accounts, when Bessus realized Alexander's cavalry was closing in, he and his co-conspirators stabbed Darius and left him to die in a supply cart, alone and bound. They fled into the night, hoping the murder would buy them time. When Alexander's men arrived, they found the dying king. A Macedonian soldier named Polystratus is said to have given Darius water and comforted him in his final moments. Darius, though mortally wounded, reportedly expressed gratitude. He asked Alexander to avenge his death, to punish the traitors who had betrayed their king. Darius died shortly thereafter. Alexander arrived soon after. When he saw the corpse, the blood, the chains, he did not celebrate. He wept. He ordered that Darius be buried with full royal honors in the tombs of his ancestors. He dressed his body in regal garments. He mourned the king he had once chased across continents. To the world, it was a message. Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was the inheritor of Persia. But grief soon gave way to purpose. Bessus had fled east into Bactria. Alexander would follow. He would not only punish the traitor, he would bring the wild mountainous east under his rule. And so the campaign turned again. The easy conquests were over. Ahead lay guerrilla warfare, cold mountain passes, and cultures unlike any Alexander had yet encountered. But first, he made a statement. He assumed the title of Shahanshah, King of Kings, the traditional style of Persian monarchs. He adopted Persian dress at court. He began integrating Persian nobles into his administration. Many of his Macedonian officers grumbled. They had marched to destroy Persia, not to become part of it. But Alexander saw further. If he was to rule this vast empire, it would not be as a foreign tyrant, but as a true king to Greeks, to Persians, and to all the peoples beyond. With Darius dead and the throne of Persia his, Alexander looked eastward once more. Ahead lay Bactria, Sogdiana, and the edge of the known world. He was no longer chasing a man. He was chasing immortality. Chapter 7. The edge of the world, Bactria and Sogdiana. To the Greeks, the eastern frontier of the Persian Empire was a place of legend. A distant realm of icy rivers, high mountains, and fierce, untamed peoples. Few had ever journeyed so far. But Alexander, having claimed the heart of Persia, was not content. His sights were set on the edge of the world, Bactria and Sogdiana, lands beyond the Oxus River, where resistance still burned. And one man stood in his path, Bessus. The traitor who had murdered Darius had fled into Bactria, hoping to raise an army among the eastern satraps and native tribes. He crowned himself Artaxerxes V, clinging to royal titles even as his support crumbled. He believed Alexander would not pursue him through such harsh terrain. He was wrong. Alexander's army, now a blend of Macedonians, Greeks, and Persians, crossed into Ariana, braving deserts, treacherous mountain passes, and biting cold. The easy victories of Egypt and Babylon were behind them. Here, war was personal, brutal, tribal. But Alexander did not flinch. City by city, fortress by fortress, he advanced, swift, relentless, merciless to those who resisted. His campaign was as much psychological as it was military. He offered clemency to those who submitted, but crushed all who stood against him. The message was clear: no corner of the former Persian Empire was beyond his reach. Eventually, Bessus was betrayed by his own men. Desperate and isolated, he was handed over to Alexander's forces. His fate was grim. Alexander ordered that Bessus be publicly mutilated, his ears and nose cut off, in the Persian tradition, for traitors, and then executed. Justice, as Alexander saw it, had been served. But Bessus was only the beginning. The mountains of Sogdiana held more than exiles. Here, tribal chieftains and local warlords resisted fiercely, fighting from cliffs and caves, ambushing supply lines, retreating into the wilderness. They knew the terrain, they knew how to wait. Alexander, in turn, adapted. He split his forces, led rapid marches through snow and rock, scaled sheer cliffs at night, and laid siege to fortresses that had never fallen. His army became something new, not a marching column, but a striking storm appearing where no enemy expected. One of the most legendary episodes came at the Sogdian Rock, a fortress perched atop a near-vertical cliff, said to be unscalable. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the defenders mocked him. "You will need men who can fly." Alexander took it as a challenge. He selected 300 of his best climbers, soldiers with nerves of steel, and had them scale the cliff under cover of darkness, using ropes and tent pegs driven into crevices. Many fell to their deaths, but by dawn the survivors appeared above the fortress, waving flags. The defenders, stunned, surrendered without a fight. It was not just conquest, it was legend in the making. But the conquests of Sogdiana also changed Alexander himself. Here he met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. Accounts vary. Some say she was captured, others that they met during a parley. Either way, Alexander was captivated. She was beautiful, intelligent, and, importantly, Sogdian. Their marriage, held according to local customs, shocked many of his officers. To them, Alexander was becoming too Persian, too Eastern. But Alexander saw farther than his generals. This was more than love. It was a political union, a symbol of reconciliation, a blending of cultures. He would not rule Asia as a foreigner. He would become part of it. And still, the fighting did not end. A noble named Spitamenes continued the resistance, rallying local tribes, launching guerrilla attacks, even massacring a Macedonian garrison. He proved elusive, cunning, the kind of enemy Alexander could not defeat by force alone. To quell the rebellion, Alexander unleashed a campaign of terror. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, reprisals were swift and devastating. At last, Spitamenes was betrayed by his own allies and executed. The campaign had taken years, but by 327 BCE, Central Asia was under Alexander's control, not just by arms, but by administration. He appointed local governors, garrisoned cities, and founded new ones in his name. He spread Greek culture, but also adopted Persian practices. He encouraged marriages between his officers and local women. He wore Eastern dress in court. The fusion was deliberate, but not everyone accepted it. Tensions rose in the ranks. Some of his oldest companions felt alienated. They whispered of betrayal, that their Macedonian king was losing his identity. And then it boiled over. A trusted officer, Clytus the Black, who had once saved Alexander's life, confronted him during a drunken feast. He accused Alexander of abandoning his heritage, of arrogance, of forgetting those who had raised him. In a rage, Alexander killed him with his own hand. Silence followed. The king, stunned by his own act, wept. He isolated himself for days, overcome by remorse. But something had changed. The boy who once chased glory had become a ruler, weighed down by power and loss. Still the path pressed forward. Beyond the mountains lay India, a land of gold, elephants, and unknown kings. And Alexander, restless, driven, and now master of half the world, could not resist. the journey was not yet over. Chapter 8. Into India, the land beyond the river. After years of relentless campaigning across deserts, mountains, and vast plains, Alexander reached the borders of a new world, the Indian subcontinent. To the Greeks and Macedonians, India was a land of myths and wonders, described by traders and travelers as a place of immense wealth, strange customs, and exotic beasts. Crossing the Hindu Kush mountains was itself a daunting task. Jagged peaks, treacherous passes, and unpredictable weather tested the limits of Alexander's army. Many soldiers, exhausted and homesick, began to question their king's ambition. They had conquered Persia, the heart of Asia. Why push further into unknown lands? But Alexander was undeterred. For him, the campaign was a quest not just for territory, but for immortality. To reach the edges of the world and conquer them was to write his name in the stars. In 327 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus River, entering the realm of the Punjab, ruled by powerful local kings known as Rajas. The land was fertile and rich, but the people were fierce warriors skilled in the use of war elephants and cavalry. One of the first major obstacles was the battle against Porus, a formidable Indian king who ruled a large territory between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers. Porus was famous for his courage and leadership, commanding an army with hundreds of elephants, cavalry, and infantry. The confrontation came at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE. Alexander's forces faced a river crossing under enemy fire, a risky maneuver. Using deception and careful planning, Alexander crossed the river upstream under cover of night, catching Porus by surprise. The battle was fierce and brutal. War elephants charged the Macedonian lines, causing confusion and fear among the soldiers. But Alexander's troops adapted, targeting the elephants' vulnerable flanks and eyes. Cavalry units outflanked the Indian forces. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, advancing steadily. Porus fought valiantly and was eventually captured, but Alexander, impressed by his bravery and nobility, restored him to his kingdom as a loyal ally. This gesture symbolized Alexander's approach in India: to conquer with a mix of force and diplomacy, to win hearts as well as lands. Despite this victory, the Indian campaign was far from easy. The harsh climate, unfamiliar terrain, and continuous guerrilla warfare by local tribes tested the endurance of Alexander's army. Many soldiers longed for home, weary from years of fighting and marching thousands of miles from Macedon. In 325 BCE, after crossing the Indus and fighting several battles, the army reached the Beas River, the easternmost point of Alexander's advance. There, his troops, exhausted and fearing the unknown lands beyond, refused to march further. Facing mutiny, Alexander reluctantly agreed to turn back. The journey home would prove just as perilous. Alexander led his men through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert, a barren wasteland of scorching heat and scarce water. Many soldiers perished, but through hardship and loss, the spirit of the army endured. The return journey was marked by difficult battles, tense negotiations with local rulers, and the founding of new cities, symbols of Greek culture and power scattered like seeds across the vast continent. By the time Alexander reached Persia again, in 324 BCE, his empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, the largest the world had ever seen. Yet for all his success, Alexander's story was far from over. He had conquered lands, won battles, and created legends. But ruling such a vast, diverse empire demanded more than military genius. It required wisdom, diplomacy, and endurance. The final chapters of his life would reveal the man behind the myth. Chapter 9. The Return and the Legacy. After the grueling campaigns in India and the arduous journey back through the Gedrosian desert, Alexander finally returned to the heart of his empire. But his world had changed, as had he. His army was diminished in numbers and worn from years of continuous warfare. Yet, the spirit of conquest still burned fiercely in Alexander's eyes. Back in Susa and Persepolis, Alexander was greeted not only as a conqueror, but as a ruler seeking to unite East and West. He held grand ceremonies that blended Macedonian, Greek, and Persian traditions. He adopted Persian royal customs fully, wearing the diadem and sitting on a throne like the ancient Persian kings. To many Macedonians, this seemed a betrayal, an abandonment of their simpler warrior culture. Alexander tried to bridge these worlds. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, forging political alliances and symbolizing the fusion of cultures. One such mass wedding took place at Susa, where Alexander himself married Stateira II, daughter of Darius III, alongside many of his officers marrying Persian noblewomen. But the more he embraced his role as a universal monarch, the more tensions grew among his followers. The Macedonians, proud and fiercely loyal, chafed at the idea of blending with the very people they had once fought to conquer. Amid this unrest, Alexander continued to plan further expeditions, dreaming of conquering Arabia, exploring the mysteries of the Red Sea, and even sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules to reach the western edge of the known world. But fate had other plans. In 323 BCE, at the age of just 32, Alexander fell ill in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery, debated by historians for centuries. Some suggest malaria, others poisoning, or perhaps complications from his many battle wounds and heavy drinking. His death plunged the empire into chaos. Without a clear successor, his son was unborn and his half-brother deemed unfit, Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, began vying for control. The vast empire he had forged shattered into pieces, divided among warlords and satraps. Yet Alexander's legacy endured far beyond his years. He had changed the course of history. He spread Hellenistic culture across 3 continents, blending Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian influences in a new world civilization. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became centers of learning and culture, nurturing science, philosophy, and the arts for centuries to come. His vision of a united world, though unfulfilled, inspired generations of leaders and conquerors. Alexander the Great was not only a warrior king but a symbol of ambition, courage, and the human desire to transcend boundaries. His story is a testament to the power of vision and the cost of greatness. As we look back on his path, from a boy tutored by Aristotle to the master of the known world, we see not just a conqueror, but a man who dreamed of touching the infinite. And in those dreams, his legend lives on. Epilogue: The enduring legacy of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's life was brief, but extraordinarily impactful. Though he died at the young age of 32, his conquests reshaped the ancient world in ways that still resonate today. His campaigns not only toppled empires but also created a new cultural and political landscape known as the Hellenistic era. This period saw the blending of Greek culture with those of Persia, Egypt, Central Asia, and India, forging new ideas in art, science, philosophy, and governance. Cities founded by Alexander, such as Alexandria in Egypt, became vibrant centers of learning and culture. Libraries amassed scrolls from across the known world, scholars debated philosophy and mathematics, and innovations in astronomy and medicine flourished. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion influenced trade routes, languages, and the spread of ideas. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, facilitating communication and exchange among diverse peoples. Politically, his empire's fragmentation led to new kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi, each adopting and adapting Hellenistic customs, laying foundations for future civilizations. Beyond history and politics, Alexander's story continues to inspire. His ambition, courage, and relentless pursuit of greatness have become a symbol for explorers, leaders, and dreamers across the ages. Yet his life also serves as a reminder of the cost of power, the personal sacrifices, the betrayals, and the fragility of human ambition. In the end, Alexander's greatest legacy may not be the lands he conquered, but the world he helped create, a world where cultures intertwined, knowledge spread, and the possibilities of human endeavor expanded beyond any known horizon. His legend, immortalized in stories, art, and history, endures, inviting each generation to reflect on the meaning of greatness and the limits of destiny.